Every history book skips this. Before potatoes existed in Europe, medieval people had discovered the ultimate survival food. It was so effective that when potatoes finally arrived, we downgraded our entire food system. Why would we abandon something that was clearly superior? The answer will blow your mind. Look, I know what you're thinking. Medieval people must have been absolutely miserable without their beloved French fries and mashed potatoes, right? Well, here's the thing that might blow your mind. Potatoes didn't even exist in Europe during medieval times. Not a single spud in sight. Those humble potatoes we can't live without today, they were chilling in South America, completely unknown to Europeans until Spanish explorers stumbled upon them in the late 1500s. That's well after knights stopped clanking around in armor and peasants stopped dying of plague every other Tuesday. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval Europeans weren't sitting around starving, wondering what to do with their Sunday roasts. They had something better, way better actually. Instead of potatoes, they relied on root vegetables that could handle Europe's notoriously moody weather. We're talking about parsnips and carrots, the real MVPs of medieval dining. These hardy little warriors could grow in cold, damp climates where even potatoes would eventually struggle once they arrived centuries later. Now, carrots back then weren't the orange traffic cones we know today. Most were purple, white, or yellow. Makes sense, right? But here's the kicker. They were absolutely packed with vitamin A. While modern folks pop supplements like candy, medieval people were naturally boosting their eyesight with every carrot they munched. Pretty smart for people who supposedly lived in the Dark Ages. Then there's the parsnip situation. Romans had introduced these sweet, nutty beauties to Europe, and medieval folks absolutely ran with it. Think of parsnips as potatoes' sophisticated older cousin who went to university and learned 3 languages. They're sweeter, more flavorful, and frankly, they make potatoes look like bland disappointments. The weird part is how versatile these vegetables were. Medieval cooks weren't just boiling everything into submission like some sort of culinary nightmare. They were roasting parsnips until they caramelized, adding them to stews for sweetness, and even making desserts with them. Parsnip cakes were apparently a thing, and honestly, they sound way more interesting than another boring potato dish. But wait, it gets better. These root vegetables weren't just tasty substitutes, they were nutritional powerhouses that put our beloved potatoes to shame. More fiber, more minerals, more flavor. Basically everything potatoes wish they could be when they grow up. Well, here's something that might surprise you even more. While we've been obsessing over parsnips and carrots, there was another vegetable that medieval people considered absolutely essential. This humble root was so important that it literally kept entire populations alive during harsh winters, and it had a secret weapon against disease that potatoes could never match. Now, while carrots were busy improving everyone's eyesight, parsnips were quietly becoming the real MVPs of medieval kitchens. These cream-colored root vegetables weren't just filling stomachs, they were actually outperforming what we'd eventually get with potatoes. Here's where it gets interesting. Parsnips pack more fiber than potatoes ever dreamed of having. We're talking about serious digestive support here, folks. When your main entertainment options were watching grass grow or attending public executions, having a properly functioning digestive system was no joke. But the real magic happened when medieval cooks started working with them. Boiled parsnips? Delicious. Mashed parsnips? Even better. Tossed into soups and stews? Pure gold. These weren't just survival foods. They were actually enhancing meals in ways that would make modern nutritionists weep with joy. The Romans, bless their engineering hearts, had introduced parsnips to Europe centuries earlier. Smart move, considering these vegetables developed this incredible sweet, nutty flavor when cooked properly. Think of mild maple syrup, but in vegetable form. No added sugar needed. Nature was already handling the dessert department. Well, speaking of dessert, medieval monasteries were absolutely obsessed with parsnip cakes. Yes, you heard that right. Cake made from root vegetables, and apparently it was the bee's knees. Those monks knew something we forgot somewhere along the way. Food records from monasteries show parsnips appearing in recipe after recipe, like they were the medieval equivalent of today's avocado toast trend. And the weird part is, parsnips were actually delivering superior nutrition compared to our beloved potatoes. Higher magnesium content? Check. More potassium? Double check. These roots were basically nature's multivitamin, disguised as humble vegetables that grew happily in Europe's less than ideal climate conditions. Medieval cooks got creative too. They'd slow cook parsnips until that natural sweetness concentrated into something that could satisfy sweet tooth cravings without any fancy imported sugar. Remember, this was long before anyone could just pop into a grocery store for a candy bar. Your dessert options were pretty much sweet parsnip concoction or hope someone finds honey. Then there's the storage factor. Unlike our modern potatoes that sprout eyes faster than a suspicious spouse, parsnips could hang around in root cellars for months without turning into science experiments. They just sit there, patiently waiting to become someone's dinner, getting sweeter with time like a fine wine. Makes sense why medieval people didn't feel like they were missing anything, right? They had this incredible root vegetable that was sweet, nutritious, versatile, and reliable. But parsnips weren't the only vegetables showing potatoes how it's really done. Wait until you hear about the unsung heroes that were adding serious flavor kicks to medieval meals. While parsnips were getting all the medieval spotlight, turnips were quietly doing the heavy lifting in kitchens across Europe. These humble white and purple bulbs were like the dependable friend who never gets invited to parties, but always shows up when you need help moving. And trust me, medieval folks needed all the help they could get. Turnips had something potatoes never could match. They were absolutely fearless in the face of drought. When other crops were throwing in the towel faster than a boxer with a glass jaw, turnips just kept growing. They'd sit there in terrible soil, laughing at poor weather conditions like they were watching a bad comedy show. But here's where it gets interesting. Turnips weren't just survival food. They packed more vitamin C than a medieval pharmacist's wildest dreams. While sailors centuries later would be dealing with scurvy on long voyages, medieval communities munching on turnips were basically getting their daily dose of health insurance. Pretty smart for people who thought bathing was optional, right? The flavor game was completely different too. Where potatoes bring all the excitement of watching paint dry, turnips delivered a peppery kick that could wake up your taste buds from a coma. Raw turnips had this sharp, almost spicy bite that made meals actually interesting. Cooked turnips mellowed out but still maintained enough personality to remind you that you weren't eating cardboard. Medieval cooks weren't playing around with turnip preparation either. They'd slice them raw for crunch, boil them into submission for stews, mash them like they owed money, or, and this is where they got really clever, ferment them for long-term storage. Fermented turnips were basically medieval meal prep, except they actually improved with age instead of turning into science experiments in the back of the fridge. Historical records show that turnips weren't just peasant grub either. Royal kitchens were serving these bad boys alongside fancy meats and imported spices. When you're good enough for kings who could literally eat anything they wanted, you know you've made it. Then there's the preservation angle that makes modern food storage look primitive. Medieval folks would ferment turnips in ways that kept them fresh through brutal winters. No electricity, no refrigeration, just good old-fashioned fermentation doing its magic. These fermented turnip dishes weren't just surviving the winter, they were thriving, developing complex flavors that would make modern foodies weep with joy. The versatility was absolutely ridiculous. Turnips could be your entire meal or just a supporting player. They'd bulk up soups, add crunch to salads, or stand alone as the main event. Well, speaking of foods that dominated medieval tables, there was something even more fundamental than turnips that kept entire civilizations running. While everyone else was digging around for root vegetables, medieval people had already mastered something far more sophisticated. Bread wasn't just food, it was practically currency. You could literally pay your rent with loaves in some places, which makes our modern obsession with sourdough starters look pretty tame. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval bread wasn't the fluffy white stuff your grandmother warned you about. These folks were grinding wheat, rye, and barley together like they were creating some ancient superfood blend. And honestly, they kind of were. The process alone puts our modern convenience to shame. Picture entire communities gathering around massive stone watermills, their wheels turning with the steady rhythm of rushing water. The sound echoed through valleys like medieval white noise machines. Every grain was precious, every kernel counted. Well, except when it didn't. Wealthy folks got their pure white wheat bread, basically the medieval equivalent of driving a luxury car. Meanwhile, peasants munched on maslin bread, a hearty mix of rye and wheat that probably had more nutritional value than anything in our grocery stores today. Talk about irony. Then there's the fiber content that would make modern nutritionists weep with joy. Unlike potatoes, which are basically starch bombs wrapped in brown skin, whole grain medieval bread delivered serious nutrition. We're talking about fiber levels that kept entire populations regular. And trust me, that mattered when your bathroom was a hole in the ground. The community aspect was something else entirely. Bread baking wasn't just cooking, it was social networking medieval style. Village ovens became gathering spots where gossip flowed as freely as the flour dust. Everyone knew everyone else's business, partly because they were all waiting in line with their dough. But the real genius, storage, and versatility. Medieval bakers created loaves that could last for days, even weeks when properly stored. These weren't going moldy after 2 days like our pampered modern versions. Hard bread became the base for countless meals, soaked in broths, crumbled into stews, or simply gnawed on during long journeys. And let's not forget the regional varieties that put our artisanal bread shops to shame. Every area had its signature style, passed down through generations like family secrets. Some were dense and dark, others surprisingly light. Each told a story about local grains, water quality, and centuries of refined technique. The symbolism ran deep too. Bread represented life itself, featured in religious ceremonies, and marked every important occasion. Breaking bread together wasn't just a phrase, it was a sacred act that bonded communities. Makes you wonder what other nutritional powerhouses they were hiding in their pantries, right? Because while bread kept medieval Europe running, there were other protein-packed foods that put our modern supplements to shame. Medieval folks knew something we're just rediscovering today. Protein doesn't have to come from a drive-through window. While we're obsessing over our daily protein shakes, they were getting their muscle fuel from tiny powerhouses that could sit in storage longer than your uncle's old fishing stories. Lentils ruled the medieval kitchen like a benevolent dictator. These little round gems packed more protein per serving than most people realize, and unlike our modern potato obsession, they actually built strong bodies instead of just filling stomachs. A cup of cooked lentils delivers about 18 grams of protein. That's more than 2 eggs for those keeping score. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval people didn't just toss lentils in a pot and call it dinner. They were culinary wizards with these legumes, creating dishes that would make today's food bloggers weep with envy. Lentil pottage was their equivalent of comfort food, slow-cooked with herbs and whatever vegetables they had hanging around. Then there were beans, the workhorses of medieval agriculture. Broad beans, field beans, and black-eyed peas grew like weeds in European soil. Peasants would plant them between rows of grain, maximizing every square inch of farmland. Smart move, considering these beans were fixing nitrogen in the soil while providing tomorrow's dinner. The real genius? Storage. While potatoes rot faster than gossip in a small town, dried legumes could last for years. Medieval families would hang cloth bags of dried peas and beans in their rafters, creating a protein pantry that laughed in the face of harsh winters and crop failures. Peas porridge hot, peas porridge cold, peas porridge in the pot 9 days old. Remember that nursery rhyme? That wasn't just silly wordplay. Split pea porridge actually could sit in the pot for days, getting thicker and more flavorful as time went on. Talk about meal prep before meal prep was cool. Medieval monks took legume cooking to an art form. Their recipe collections, carefully preserved in monastery libraries, reveal sophisticated techniques for preparing everything from lentil fritters to bean-based mock meat dishes for Lent. These guys understood food chemistry centuries before anyone knew what chemistry was. The iron content in these legumes kept medieval workers energized for backbreaking labor. While modern office workers reach for energy drinks, medieval farmers got their boost from iron-rich beans and lentils that actually sustained energy levels throughout grueling workdays. Well, legumes weren't the only plant foods keeping medieval people healthy and strong. Those leafy greens growing in every available patch of soil had their own remarkable story to tell, and their nutritional punch might surprise anyone who thinks medieval diets were boring and bland. Medieval gardens looked nothing like today's potato-heavy plots. Walk through any castle courtyard or monastery garden back then, and you'd find rows upon rows of leafy greens that put our modern salads to shame. Cabbage ruled supreme, and for good reason. These weren't your grandmother's sad-boiled cabbages either. Medieval cabbages packed more nutritional punch than a modern multivitamin. Rich in vitamin K, they kept bones strong and blood clotting properly. Pretty important when your local barber moonlighted as a surgeon with questionable hygiene standards. But here's where it gets interesting. While we treat cabbage like the boring vegetable your kids hide under their mashed potatoes, medieval folks knew how to make it sing. They'd prepare it with vinegar and herbs, creating tangy dishes that actually had flavor. Makes sense, right? When you don't have access to exotic spices from around the world, you learn to make ordinary ingredients extraordinary. Then there's the preservation genius. Medieval people invented sauerkraut long before Germans got credit for it. They discovered that fermenting cabbage not only made it last through brutal winters, but actually improved its nutritional value. Talk about accidental biochemistry. These folks were creating probiotics centuries before anyone knew what gut health meant. Well, cabbage wasn't flying solo in medieval gardens. Leeks dominated Welsh cuisine like potatoes dominate Irish cooking today. These onion relatives added sharp, distinctive flavors that made simple peasant meals memorable. Welsh cooks combined leeks with whatever meat they could find, creating hearty stews that sustained families through harsh seasons. And the weird part is how versatile these greens actually were. Fresh cabbage leaves served as wraps, basically medieval tortillas. Older, tougher leaves got thrown into pots for hours, creating rich broths that extracted every nutrient possible. Nothing went to waste because waste meant hunger. Medieval manuscripts reveal something fascinating about leafy greens. Unlike potatoes, which basically just fill you up with starch, these vegetables provided essential vitamins that prevented diseases we rarely think about today. Scurvy, night blindness, bleeding disorders, all kept at bay by humble garden greens. But why did cabbage work so well in medieval Europe? Simple climate adaptation. These hardy vegetables thrived in cool, wet conditions that would rot potatoes in the ground. They grew fast, stored well, and produced multiple harvests per season when managed correctly. The preparation methods varied wildly too. Raw cabbage got chopped into early versions of coleslaw. Cooked cabbage became the base for countless soup variations. Pickled cabbage provided an acidic punch that brightened heavy winter meals dominated by preserved meats and stored grains. Medieval cooks understood something we've forgotten. Vegetables don't have to be boring side dishes. They treated greens as essential meal components, not afterthoughts. Their creativity with simple ingredients puts our modern convenience culture to shame. Speaking of essential meal components, medieval kitchens had another secret weapon that provided concentrated nutrition in surprisingly portable packages. When medieval folks needed serious energy for a day of back-breaking labor, they didn't reach for a bag of chips. They grabbed a handful of nuts. Hazelnuts, walnuts, and almonds weren't just snacks back then. They were medieval power bars. Think about it. These little nuggets packed more calories per ounce than almost anything else they could get their hands on. A handful of almonds delivered enough fuel to swing an axe for hours, which beats our modern energy drinks that leave you crashing faster than a knight falling off his horse. But here's where it gets interesting. Medieval cooks discovered they could grind these nuts into flour, creating what we'd now call gluten-free alternatives centuries before anyone knew what gluten was. Almond flour made delicate cakes for wealthy tables, while ground hazelnuts thickened soups for common folk. Smart, right? The fat content in nuts solved another huge problem. Medieval Europe desperately needed cooking oils, and crushing nuts provided exactly that. Walnut oil became the olive oil of Northern Europe, adding rich flavor to vegetables that would make modern foodies weep with joy. These oils lasted longer than butter and didn't spoil as quickly, crucial when your refrigerator was basically a cold stone cellar. Well, here's something that'll surprise you. Almonds became the base for medieval milk that had nothing to do with cows. Almond milk appeared in countless recipes, from creamy sauces to rich broths. Medieval chefs were making plant-based alternatives before it was trendy, and honestly, they probably did it better than most coffee shops today. Seeds played their part too. Sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, and flax seeds provided essential nutrients that kept people healthy through brutal winters. These tiny powerhouses delivered iron, magnesium, and healthy fats that sustained energy levels far better than simple starches ever could. The wealthy treated nuts like precious gems. Manuscripts show elaborate dishes where almonds were blanched, sliced paper thin, and arranged like artwork on platters. Pine nuts, imported at ridiculous expense, appeared in recipes reserved for kings and bishops. Makes you wonder if they knew something we've forgotten about real luxury food. But even peasants understood nuts' value. They collected wild hazelnuts and walnuts each autumn, storing them carefully for the lean months ahead. These stored better than most vegetables and provided concentrated nutrition when fresh food became scarce. A small pouch of mixed nuts could mean the difference between thriving and merely surviving through winter. Medieval people weren't just randomly eating nuts, they instinctively knew these foods delivered sustained energy without the crashes that come from simple carbohydrates. They discovered that a breakfast including nuts kept them satisfied until evening, while bread alone left them hungry again within hours. And the best part? Unlike potatoes, which need cooking and seasoning to taste decent, nuts come pre-packaged by nature, ready to eat and absolutely delicious.